Hi guys, and welcome to our first lesson looking at transporting animals. Now in this whole topic, we're going to learn about how the cells in our body are going to receive the oxygen and the glucose they need to make energy. By the end of both lessons, you should be able to describe the structure of the heart. You should be able to compare the structure of arteries, veins and capillaries, which are our blood vessels. And you should be able to explain the different role each cell within the blood plays within the body. Okay, so sometimes you'll hear this term, the circulatory system. So what does that mean? Well, as you might know from physics, a circuit is when you have a complete wires connecting from the battery around components and back again. The circuits in our bodies are how the blood transports around the body. So the heart is the main organ which drives this, and then we've got the vessels in which the blood travels through around the body to reach every cell in the body. Okay, so just a quick starter. Which cells, tissues and organs do you think are involved in the circulatory system? So pause now, have a think and then press play again. Okay, so the heart is an organ because it's made up of different tissues. The lungs are also an organ and they're made up of different tissues. So the heart and the lungs are close together because they are connected and have an important role to work together to keep you alive. In terms of tissues, we've got different tissues such as the tissues which make up the capillaries, the veins and the arteries. Different individual cells are involved. So like for example, we're going to have muscle cells and muscle tissues in the heart to allow it to contract, to squeeze. We're going to have individual cells such as the red blood cell and the white blood cells, which have different important roles in the body. Okay, so this is going to be part one of a two-part video. Part one, we're going to look at the different chemicals that are found in the blood and how they're transported around the body. We're also going to look at the cells which are inside the blood and their different functions. Finally, we're going to look at the three different types of blood vessels through which the blood travels. Okay, so first of all, what is in your blood? Well, right now you're sitting here putting things into your blood because you're digesting your food, which is in the lower half here in the digestive system, and you're breathing in oxygen from your lungs and you're breathing out carbon dioxide from your lungs. So these are connected. So the molecules that are transported around the body. First of all, we've got amino acids. So you break down your food into amino acids in your digestive system. And in the small intestine, and we'll look at this next topic, the amino acids are absorbed into the blood and they're transported to all the cells because the ribosomes in the cells join amino acids together to make the proteins, which make up most of the structures inside our cells. Glucose is also a type of sugar absorbed by the small intestine, and again the blood carries the glucose to the cells so the cells can make energy from the breakdown of the glucose sugar. Oxygen then is carried from the lungs, specifically the alveoli, to the cells by red blood cells. Okay, so these red blood cells in the blood carry the oxygen. Now our cells need this for aerobic respiration. That's part of the process of cells making energy from the glucose, but when there's oxygen present, they can do aerobic respiration in the mitochondria and make many more ATP, energy. However, carbon dioxide is a waste product of that aerobic respiration, so it must be carried away from the cells to the lungs so it's removed from the body. If it builds up in the body, it can cause serious harm. So there you go, 4 main molecules or chemicals which are transported in the blood. So the blood itself is mostly water, okay, it's mostly water based. It's not pure water though, because it's carrying those chemicals such as glucose and amino acids. Okay, so it's more of a kind of yellow colour in fact. And sometimes in hospital shows you'll see a kind of yellow bag of plasma hanging up, and that's being connected to the person, the patient, through a tube, and they're adding plasma to the person. Okay, so let's have a look at the blood. Now you can't see the liquid plasma here, but we can see the red blood cells floating inside that plasma as they pass down this tube, which is a blood vessel. Okay? The blood is our only liquid tissue. It's called a tissue because there's different types of cells in the blood. So because there's different types of cells, we call it a tissue. And that's what the definition of a tissue is, when different cells work together. So what cells are found in our blood? Well, let's have a look. So you can see the yellow plasma here, and we can spot the red blood cells, we can spot the white blood cells, and you can also see there's these kind of like orangey coloured ones which almost have like kind of tentacles, and these are our platelets. They're shaped like that so they can stick together easily. So as a quick recap, we've already talked about stem cells. Stem cells are unspecialised cells which can become specialised. So in your bone marrow, which is the inner part of your bones, you have tissue stem cells. And now these stem cells can turn into the different types of cell found in the blood. So the stem cells in your bones can turn into specialised white blood cells, such as phagocytes or lymphocytes. They can turn into red blood cells, or they can turn into platelets. Ignore the words in the brackets because that's like higher stroke university level. So our cells divide, remember that? They divide for growth and repair to replace damaged cells. If you ask what a stem cell is, you would say an unspecialised cell which can turn into different specialised cells. There's a certain condition which can be treated with a bone marrow transplant. That condition is a cancer of the blood, and it's called leukemia. So leukemia is because you don't have working cells in your blood, so you add new stem cells to the bone marrow and they start to make replacement cells. Okay, so let's start with the red blood cell. Its job is to carry oxygen. Now inside the red blood cell there's a protein called hemoglobin. Now hemoglobin is what the oxygen binds to, and that's really important you know that. So oxygen binds to hemoglobin, forming oxyhemoglobin, and that happens inside the red blood cell. The red blood cell itself has what we call a biconcave shape. It's like a disc with a dimple on either side. That dimple increases the surface area so it can absorb more oxygen. There's a typo there, not absorbing blood, absorbing oxygen, okay? So we call it a biconcave shape. It has no nucleus, so there's more space for the oxyhemoglobin. And if you spend time at a high altitude, your body actually increases in the number of red blood cells that you have. Okay, so hemoglobin, it's important. You know that hemoglobin, you can see in the close-up picture there, is a protein packed inside our red blood cells. Oxygen enters the red blood cell, so it diffuses through the membrane of the red blood cell, and it binds to the hemoglobin, forming oxyhemoglobin. So if you're asked how oxygen is transported around the body, you would say that oxygen binds to hemoglobin inside red blood cells. Okay, our immune system is what defends the body from the pathogens, the viruses and bacteria which cause disease. And there's many interesting ways that they can do this, okay? We're going to look at two very basic ways that white blood cells defend the body from disease-causing cells, and we call the disease-causing cells pathogens. So our first type is phagocytes, and as you can see in the image there, the phagocyte basically engulfs and then destroys pathogens. Don't say eat, it doesn't have a mouth, okay? So you're going to use the phrase engulf. It takes a pathogen inside of itself and destroys it. The bottom right is showing this actually under a microscope. So the cartoon represents what the microscope's actually showing, the red pathogen being engulfed, and then it's broken down and destroyed by red blood cells. Okay, so phagocytes are a type of specialised white blood cell. So they're created by the stem cells. They engulf and destroy pathogens using digestive enzymes. Okay, now that process has its own name, which is similar to the name of the cell. The cell is called a phagocyte, and the process of engulfing and destroying it is called phagocytosis. So you can pause and take notes as we go through. These are non-specific, meaning they'll destroy any type of pathogen. Okay, our lymphocytes are a different type of white blood cell. Now the lymphocytes actually, when they recognise a pathogen that's happening here, they start to make a protein called antibodies. Okay, so they start to divide and divide and divide. You have lots of lymphocytes and they start to make antibodies, these little yellow shaped things, and the antibodies basically destroy the pathogens. Okay, so if the phagocyte's a bit like Pac-Man because it engulfs and destroys, the lymphocyte is a bit more like Spider-Man because it shoots out these antibodies which stick to the pathogens and destroy them. So again, it's a specialised white blood cell. It releases antibodies, and the antibodies bind to pathogens, and it makes it easier for the phagocytes to destroy them. Okay, our final type is the platelets, the ones that I said are kind of designed to stick together. So what happens sometimes inside your blood vessel is you can have damage, especially if you eat too much fatty foods. The walls inside your arteries can become hardened, and that means they can crack and become damaged. And you can see here the kind of white shaped platelets sticking to them. So they're a type of blood cell, again made in the bone marrow. They respond to chemicals in the body's damage, and they're responsible for blood clotting. So all you need to know is that platelets are the cells which clot to form blood clots. Okay? Okay, so the blood is a tissue because it's made up of different cells. The heart is an organ because it's made up of different tissues, like nerve tissue and muscle tissue and blood tissue, okay? Now, it pumps the blood around the different blood vessels in the body, which are the tubes the blood travels in. And you can see here there's a blue one and there's some red ones, and that's what we're going to look at next. So, basically, as a figure of 8, you can always think of the circulatory system as a figure of 8. Always starts with the heart. The blood's either going around the body and back to the heart, or the blood's going from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart. So it's like a figure of 8 pattern. On the left, you can see this in a bit more in depth, okay? And you can see something labelled tissue capillaries, and there's a close-up in the bottom right. So you can see the artery in the red is arriving at the capillary. The blood travels through all these tiny, tiny little blood vessels called capillaries, and then eventually it feeds its whole way back into the same vein, and the veins head back to the heart. So let's look at these in a bit more depth. Now, on the picture here, we're going to look at valves, and then we're going to look at arteries. And you can see already by looking at the two pictures on the left and right, they look similar, but they also have differences between them as well. A good memory aid for this is arteries start with A, so the arteries are always when the blood goes away from the heart. So any blood travelling from the heart is always travelling in an artery, which means that any blood travelling to the heart is travelling in a vein. Veins start with V, and veins have valves. So if you look at the red artery, you can see the wall's much thicker. Now it's important to say thick, but thicker, because you're comparing it to the vein. So it has a thicker wall, and the reason it has a thicker wall is because it's travelling away from the heart's just beat, and it's under high pressure, which means it might burst. So it has that thick wall to stop it bursting. When you feel for your pulse, you're feeling that heartbeat because the blood's pulsing along that thick artery. So when you feel for your pulse, you're feeling for an artery, and as the blood travels down it and pulses, it stretches the artery wider, and then the elastic artery goes back to being narrower again, okay? So it has a thick wall. If you look at the blue vein here, the wall is much thinner. So there's a comparison. Artery has a thicker wall, the vein has a thinner wall. The vein also has these valves. So you can see they're like swing doors. The blood's going to push them open as it flows, but it means if the blood slows down and almost tries to go back on itself, the valves swing shut, okay? So artery walls are thicker as the blood pressure is under higher pressure. Vein walls are thinner as the blood is under low pressure. But because it's under low pressure, that means the blood travels slower, which means they need valves. And if you look at the blue picture with the arrows going up, you can see if any blood comes back the way, the valve would close. So here's a quote from SQA. How do you describe the function of the valves? You can see it here in this picture. If the blood slows under low pressure, the valve prevents the backflow of blood, and that's the terminology to use. So again, keep pausing the video and making notes as you go. Finally, we have the capillaries. Now here's a capillary, and in it you can see the red blood cells, and you can see there's carbon dioxide travelling from the blood into that structure there, where there's oxygen waiting and the oxygen is travelling the opposite direction, okay? Now, that is called an exchange of materials. Carbon dioxide one way, oxygen the other way. The arteries and the veins, even the vein with a thinner wall, the walls are still too thick for chemicals such as oxygen and carbon dioxide to pass through. So capillaries are always used for the exchange of material because the walls of the capillary are only 1 cell thick. Now be careful, this is animal cells we're talking about, so there's no cell walls involved. The cells don't have walls. We're talking about the wall of the capillary tube itself. Okay, so the pulmonary circulatory system is when our lungs and our heart kind of connect. So we have blood without oxygen travelling in veins to the heart. The heart pumps in arteries to the lungs where it gets oxygen, and then veins carry that oxygenated blood back to the heart where it's pumped out into arteries around the body. And that's our next lesson. But right now, we're just going to have a quick look at how that happens in the lungs. So in your lungs, you've got all these air sacs called alveolus, and they're surrounded by capillaries. We'll come to this in our next topic, but for now, that capillary network has a key feature. One, it has very thin walls, only 1 cell thick, and that allows the exchange of materials for CO2 to pass from the blood into the alveoli and for oxygen to pass from the alveoli through the wall of the air sac, through the wall of the capillary, and the oxygen enters the blood and then it enters the red blood cell where it binds to hemoglobin. Okay? Now that happens inside your lungs every time you breathe. So you're breathing in, the air goes all the way down and fills up the air sacs. The air has more oxygen than carbon dioxide, so the oxygen from the air enters through the wall of the alveoli into the capillary. At the same time, the carbon dioxide in the blood travels from the capillary into the air sac and it's breathed out by the person. So what is the function of capillaries? They allow the exchange of materials between the blood and the cells of the body, as the capillary walls are very thin. Okay guys, that's the end of lesson 1. Lesson 2 will look in depth at the 4 blood vessels that are connected to the heart specifically, and we'll look at the structure of the heart. So you need to now go back, pause the video, make notes. You need to know the different chemicals in the blood. You need to know the job of the red blood cell. You need to know the features of the red blood cell. And you need to know the 2 types of white blood cells and what their job is. You need to know the job of the platelets. You then need to be able to compare arteries and veins. What are the structural differences between them? You need to be able to say what the function of the valves are, and you need to be able to describe the structure of capillaries and what their function is. Okay, so make sure you can do that.